So you can go to the GitHub repo, and we can take the collab notebook link. It's under the collab hands-on session number 3, which is for the brain decoding. You can follow this collab link, and so we'll get to this link where we first, so brain decoding, as discussed, we would be mapping, like we would be trying to get the stimuli features from the brain neural net brain representations, neural embeddings. So first we'll clone the clone the GitHub repo for the features, that pre-extracted features that we have. And for the fMRI data, we can, similar to what we did earlier, you can get the link from the by filling up this form. So so I'll fill it up. You can push yes here, and you can get the link for the drive where you can download the fMRI dataset, and you can replace it here in the quotations. So as you can see in the first that the GitHub repo that we cloned, we already had the features extracted for each of the video, all the text, audio, and video features, visual features that we had. We'll also get the fMRI. We'll unzip the fMRI file. So as you can see, we get the .nni files, which contains the fMRI data for all the video clips that we have. We have around 12 video clips. I'll explain the orientation of the data set, how it is arranged. So importing the basic libraries, we are taking we have a ridge function, bootstrap ridge function written in a different file. We have the evaluate metrics written in a different file. We'll be taking codes from those files. So basically, there's a movie which is divided into 12 smaller clips of around 598 seconds. So around 10 minutes. Each clip is around 10 minutes. While the subjects were shown that 10-minute video clip, the fMRI was recorded after every 1.49 seconds. So that is 1.49 is called the TR time, of the repetition time. So there were 3 sessions in which these 12 smaller 10 minutes movies were presented. So in the 7th session, the first 3 movies were presented. In the 8th session, from 5 till 9, the movies were presented. And in the 9th session, actually the movie number 4, 10, 11, and 12 were presented. Due to RAM constraints on the collab, we'll go with the first 3 movies in the training set and the 4th movie in the testing set. So we'll be learning our model will be learning on the first 3 movies and trying to predict. Testing would be on the 4th movie. So we'll load the fMRI data basically separately for train and test. Other than that, we have already provided you with the pre-extracted features, but I'll explain you how we did it. So for the visual part of the video, so we use the ResNet 50 model to extract the embeddings. So for each 1.49 smaller video clip, which is the TR time that we have, for each of the TR video clip, we get a 2048 dimension from the ResNet 50. Similarly, for the audio, we use the MFCC features. We get a 20 dimension vector for each of that 1.49 second smaller clip. Similarly, we also had the timestamp and the word spoken transcript for the word spoken during the video. So using that, we extracted the textual features using the BERT model, which we imported from the Hugging Face pre-trained BERT model. We pass all the words that were spoken in that 1.49 seconds to the BERT, and we take the CLS embedding out of it, which is a 768 dimension, which we assume which actually represents all the words during that 1.49 seconds. So you can read about them in much detail in the links provided. We have the code for it in our repository. You can find it in the SRC folder, the feature extraction. I'll skip this part for the feature extraction. We already have the extracted feature. So for the trains, so this part is for like extracting the features. We are currently loading the pre-extracted features. So we basically load the like we had some movies in the training and some videos in the testing. So for the videos in the training, we load the training features for all the three different features that we have, modalities, and similarly for the testing part. Next, coming to forming up the target and input matrices. So as we know in decoding, we would be predicting the stimuli features from the fMRI. So and as similar to what we had in the encoding and what Subha sir just talked about, there's a delay in when we see a stimuli and when it actually the brain activates according to that stimuli. So there's a delay of few seconds. So in that case, what we do is we take the XI stimuli, let's say XI fMRI representation, and we try to predict the concatenation of all like 6 before stimuli representations. Like for XI, we'll try to predict the concatenation of yi minus 6 till yi minus 1. These are the stimuli features of the 6 previous TRs. So for the audio and video features, we'll break it up. So we'll form the input and target matrices according to these representations, the concatenated representations. We also apply the Z-score normalization at the end after we get the representations. This is just deleting for like so that the RAM doesn't get filled up. This is like for the textual representation, there was something like for some particular 1.49 second TRs, there were no words actually spoken. So we don't have the textual representation. We can't extract the textual representation for that particular TRs. So we actually deleted those TRs and the corresponding fMRI from them. So the task is same, just we deleted those TRs where we didn't have any word, and the other part is same where we actually take the 6 TRs similar features to predict the 7th fMRI. So currently we have the training matrices. We have made the training matrices. Next we come to the training part. Then we follow the similar like cross-validated rigid regression where we actually use cross-validation and test for different alphas to get the best fit for our model. Coming to the evaluation part, we would be using, like as discussed in the slides, we would be using two evaluation metrics, the pairwise accuracy and the rank accuracy. So these have been discussed in the slides. We can refer to the formula here. So it's basically for each of the pair, for each pair, like NC2 pairs will be there. For each pairs in the samples, we have the actual and predicted. So the correlation of SI actual and SI predicted plus the correlation of SJ actual and SJ predicted. If it's greater than the cross thing where correlation of SI with SJ predicted and plus correlation of SJ with SI predicted. If this part is greater, we say that the prediction was correct. So we count it as 1, else we count it as 0, and sum of this divided by the number of samples would give us the accuracy. Similarly, rank accuracy is basically we find the correlation of each predicted word with all predicted sample with all the target samples, and we rank it and take the top R ranks, and we take the, like if we see that what rank does it holds up. So coming to here, we will train the models for all the three modalities that we have. So given the input fMRI, we'll try to predict the visual features. For HTR, we'll similarly, given the audio, we'll try to predict given the fMRI, we'll try to predict the audio features. Similarly, given the fMRI, we'll try to predict the textual features one by one. We did PCA for visual features because their size was 2048 and there was a RAM issue on the collab. There's no particular reason doing PCA. We just did it to reduce the dimensionality so that we can run it on the collab. And so this is just like we get the FMRA train as the X train, FMRA test for the X test, and we have the video features training part as the Y train, and video features test part for the as the Y test. We pass it to the regression model, and we calculate the pairwise accuracy and the rank based accuracy as discussed above for the visual stimuli basically. Then similarly for audio and textual, this would take some time to for running. So I already ran it, and I'll show you the results. So for the visual features, we get an 0.73 accuracy for the pairwise accuracy and 0.67 for the rank based. For the audio features, we get 0.71 as the pairwise and 0.66 for the rank based, and for the textual, we get 0.62 and 0.58. So currently, we used whole of the voxels of the brain to actually predict the stimuli. But it can be done in a way where we take only the language area voxels to predict the, let's say, predict the textual features. So that could be done where we focus on individual brain regions and try to predict the fMRI. Currently, we get the best accuracy for the visual part, then the audio, and then the textual features. This could be possible because the video was shown and the audio was with it, but there was no textual subtitles provided during the video. Also, we could enhance upon this accuracy if we focus on particular areas in the brain which contribute in language understanding and could better predict the textual features or the audio features. We could get a better accuracy focusing on those particular areas only. So that's it. I wrap it up a bit fast. If you have any doubts, we can discuss.
Thanks a lot, Joshna, and thank you for joining us from India. So late for you over there. So thanks a lot. Great. Let's take 5 minutes, and then we'll start the next session on advanced methods. Hi, everyone. We're back from coffee break now. I know we're running a little bit late, but I will try to go through this part relatively briefly. I know I'm what's keeping you from enjoying your afternoon. So I will share slides very soon. All right. Great. Great. So this session is on advanced methods. And after this, we'll go through a very brief summary of the tutorial and also some future trends. So we talked a lot about these deep learning methods that are quite complex, and they can give us very rich representations of stimuli. But there's also challenges in using deep learning systems for cognitive neuroscience or cognitive science in general. So the first one is that they're not designed specifically to model brain processing. So when we use them as models of cognition, there are some intricacies there. So NLP systems, for example, are designed to predict upcoming words, right? So they're not specifically designed to model how the brain is processing words. So in order to overcome some of these issues, some researchers have tried to use actual brain recordings during the training of these models. And another limitation is that a lot of times these models are trained for different tasks, and people are also using these models that are pre-trained on, let's say, next word prediction, but to analyze data from different tasks in brain recordings. So incorporating different tasks during training of these models, both on the brain side and on the machine learning side, is kind of a new frontier that is not worked on a lot, but there's a lot of upcoming research that will come out very soon in that area. And the second big question is that it's sometimes difficult to interpret these representations due to multiple sources of information. So what I mean by that, well, specific representation from the model can incorporate information from the part of speech of a word, or the semantic role of this word, or its dependency on other words. And when we use all of this information to predict the brain recordings, it's not really clear what information are we using that is relevant to the brain. So that is a scientific problem, right? It's what is the scientific inference that we can make using these models? And so there's some recent work in this area that is focused on disentangling these contributions of different information sources to the predictions of the brain. So focus on this first part, in which researchers, so this is actually our work. So in this work, we used data from people watching, actually reading Harry Potter, to optimize a natural language processing system directly to predict brain recordings. So this is our standard pipeline here, but at the very end, we actually take the error signal of prediction for the fMRI and imagery recordings, and we propagate it back into the network to make it better at predicting fMRI and imagery recordings. And what we find is that it's actually indeed able to do really well at predicting unseen fMRI recordings, but not in all regions of the brain, even though it's tuned to predict whole brain activity. So it's only better in regions that are known from previous work to support language processing. So this was with models that were originally trained on just language, so to predict the next word, but we additionally fine-tuned them to also predict MEG and fMRI recordings. So I would say that in language, there's a lot less work in this area of including brain recordings to fine-tune or train models from scratch. But in vision, there's a lot of very recent work that is on the side. And this is mainly because of the existence of bigger data sets on the vision side, that the natural scenes data set, for example, from Kendrick Kay and colleagues, that has been used a lot recently to train models from scratch for vision. But I wanted to highlight one work, which is on a different data set here, which is vision again. So this is for people who watch movies and TV shows. And what the authors did here was they had a standard convolutional neural network architecture, but they constrained each layer in the neural network to specifically predict a specific layer better in the brain. So they followed the hierarchy from V1 to V4, and they forced each layer in the CNN, they constrained it to predict this specific V1 to V4 recordings from fMRI of people. So what they see is that when they compare these optimized recordings for fMRI alignment with this hierarchy from V1 to V4, they can have as good of prediction of fMRI data, of new fMRI recordings, as they do from a task-optimized network for predicting these ROI. And now this work, very recent work from the last few months, that uses this new data set, the natural scenes data set that I alluded to a few minutes ago. So here the authors trained an end-to-end model. So this is not pre-trained for any task. This is a brand new architecture with brand new weights. And so this model, the only thing it's trained for is to predict fMRI recordings in specific areas of the brain. So the authors here train several different, I think it is 4 different models. Each model is trained for a different area. So these are different visual selective regions. So for example, the fusiform face area is one of these regions. And what's very interesting, so here in this plot, I'm comparing the accuracy of these models to accuracy of task-optimized models. And again, here the authors show that there's not a significant difference between these two. But what's really interesting is that the authors also evaluated how these models would do if they never saw a specific category. So how would they perform at predicting brain activity to, let's say, faces, if the model has never seen faces during training? And they showed that indeed the performance doesn't deteriorate, which is very, very interesting. And it's very also interesting with respect to general machine learning models, which struggle to generalize to totally new categories of objects. Great. And so in a similar line of work, a different set of authors used the same data set and also trained end-to-end models. But the question they were looking for is a bit different. So here they wanted to really examine this assumption that there's feed-forward processing from V1 to V4 in the human brain. And so this assumption is coming from this correspondence that has been found for many years, starting from Dan Yemens' work in 2014, that hierarchical levels in the CNN map onto V1 to V4, to IT, in fact, in macaques. And so what these authors did, they wanted to train a single model that is optimized for all these different areas, and also have different models that are optimized for each area separately. And they wanted to see, do the separately organized, optimized models, do they come up with hierarchical representations as well? Or is there a different type of representation that can also explain these areas well, that's not necessarily hierarchical? And so in fact, that is what they find. So here on the left side, so the three leftmost plots are hierarchical models, so what's being shown here is in the lighter colors, this is the amount of variance that's explained by specific layers, so V1 through V4. And on the most right side is a model that's trained separately for each different vision area. So what they're showing is that here the early layers of these models that are trained separately can explain a lot of unique variance even in V4. So this is not something you would expect if you had hierarchical representations where each additional layer would explain less variance. So the early layers would explain less variance, unique variance as you go up the hierarchy in vision. And so these results sort of challenge this view that the human visual areas act like the early layers of a convolutional neural network. And so this is very interesting. Again, it's very recent work. And so it's going to be interesting to follow this discussion and see what it comes out to be. Okay, so I will pause here for questions because we're done with the first of 3 parts. Okay. So, any questions online? Okay, I'll continue, and you can ask questions if there are. Okay, so the second part here is to actually integrate this tasks during this alignment between the brain and machines. So we've seen a few works already that trying to fine-tune models for different tasks and evaluate the representations similarity between the models and the brain. But what's also interesting is to actually have data from people who are performing different tasks. Right, so a lot of the data that we already saw in the previous parts of the tutorial were from people who are passively viewing some stimulus. But in fact, from neuroscience, we know that tasks do affect the processing. So for example, there's research that shows the people who are viewing natural movies and are trying to attend to 2 different things. So in one, vehicles, in another condition, humans. have a different representation of semantics, of the whole semantic space is different. So not just the attended categories, which is the human versus vehicles, but also the unattended categories. And so this category-based attention during natural vision alters the representation of both of these attended and unattended categories. So here we see the task really does affect the processing of semantics. In another work that we did, where we examined the effect of a question on our processing of an actual concrete concept, what we see is that if we show, let's say, a concrete concept such as bear, and we ask two questions, is it a vegetable or is it a tool? Our brain activity while seeing this concept bear will show some systematic difference due to these different question tasks. And so what's posited from the literature is that attention is emphasizing some task-relevant information that helps us actually answer this question. But the mechanism is not really well understood. And so in this work, we set out to find, to model this interaction between the task and the stimulus. And I'll just show you one result from this work, which was using these concrete noun data sets plus line drawings. And the task here that the participants were tasked to do was to answer yes or no questions about these nouns. So like bear, and is it a vegetable, or is it dangerous? And the stimulus representation that we used in this model was from human judgment. So people actually judged different attributes of these concrete concepts. And we did this in MEG. And so what we find is that we can look at the question effect on the brain activity separately from the word effect of the brain activity. And so if we look at the word effect here, we see something canonical. So what we usually see, which is that the semantics of a word affect the processing between 200 and 600 milliseconds after the onset of the word. But what's really interesting is if we look at the question effect on the left side, we see that the question is only affecting the brain activity towards the end of semantic processing, so between 400 and 600 milliseconds. Right, so then there's other work as well on language, which looks at sentence stimuli, and here what they had two conditions, in one where people are reading sentences passively, and in another where people are reading the sentences while looking for specific relations in the sentence. And here what they found was that it's possible to predict whether a person is passively reading or performing the task with the text-based features using EEG recordings. And so this accuracy was higher than if you use just eye tracking data. So it's not just that the people are moving their eyes in specific ways. There's more information we can get from the EEG recordings that's above that. And then just a few last works on this task side. So here we're switching over to the other type of tasks affecting processing, which is the people are not performing any tasks, but now we're training the models to do different tasks and seeing how does that affect the alignment between the brain and the brain activity. And so here people were seeing natural scene images passively, and the authors here tuned different CNN models for a broad range of tasks. And so these tasks were from a computer vision paper, and they varied from semantic tasks to low dimensional geometric tasks to 2D and 3D tasks. And here this hierarchy that's being shown is obtained from this original computer vision paper. So this is basically showing the grouping of these different tasks and the different types of tasks representations grouped together. And so what these authors did, Wang et al., they examined how do the representations of these differently tuned models predict the brain recordings. And they obtained a very similar hierarchy that is also, it's strikingly similar across subjects. It's a bit similar to the original task hierarchy as well. And so here, what they concluded is that these vision tasks that transfer to each other with great accuracy actually make similar predictions for brain responses from different regions in the visual system. And then the last work on this task front is actually was already discussed. It's from Suba and his colleagues. So here the authors, inspired by this previous work, they tuned NLP models for different tasks, and they looked at how does that affect the representation similarity with the brain of people just passively viewing passages of narratives. And so what they found was that they also looked at reading versus listening, and they found that the reading fMRI is best explained by a few tasks, so coreference resolution, named entity recognition, and some shallow syntax parsing, whereas the listening fMRI was best explained by a different set of tasks, so paraphrasing, summarization, and natural language inference. And so one thing to note here is that the reading and the listening fMRI datasets were actually different. So the stimuli that the people were seeing were different. So this is a great result, but we do need to really validate this. We would need a dataset that is the same between reading and listening to know how these two different modalities interact with the different tasks. But it's a great first step. Great, so this was completed the second part of this talk. I will pause here for questions.
When you talked about the EEG signal providing more information than eye tracking, what were the actual EEG features used?
Yeah, so they use many different ones. It's a long paper with many different results. So they did frequency bands, all the frequency bands. They also looked at power in electrodes, and I think the power was the most predictive one. Yeah. No questions on the chat? Okay, great. Awesome. So continuing on to this second part, which is dear to my heart. This is, I would say, my largest area of my own research. So where we have multiple sources of information in the encodings, in the embeddings of the model, and we want to understand, we want to really make a scientific inference about what are we predicting in the brain, and what kind of information are we using. And so I want to start here with some of our work, which looked at how can we, how does the brain represent superword meaning, or the meaning of a sentence that's beyond individual words. So for example, if I show you the sentence, Mary finished the apple, the superword meaning may contain the concept of eating or apple core, or something else that is not actually present in the sentence itself. So how can we model that, right? So what we used was a neural network approach where we make an intervention to remove individual word representation meaning from the contextual meaning that's obtained from higher up levels in the network. So the intuition here is that if we don't do this, then we can, when we predict the brain activity for Mary finished an apple, we may be using information about apple or finished or Mary in this prediction step, which is something it's known that these contextual representations in the model contain this individual word information. So by removing it, we can make sure that once we predict the brain activity, we're not using this individual word information. And so I'll show you just a few results from that. So here we used the data set for people reading Harry Potter, both in fMRI and EEG, but I'll focus on the fMRI results here. And so what we find here, just with the full context, so this is before we remove the individual word meaning, is that across the language network regions of interest, we find a significant prediction across all of these regions bilaterally. So a full contextual representation can explain a large part of the cortex. But we, again, don't know whether this is individual word meaning or what are we using to do this prediction. And so once we remove the individual word meaning and we predict the brain activity using this residual superword representation, we see that only the bilateral anterior and posterior temporal lobes are significantly predicted. So this suggests that both the bilateral PTL and ATL process the superword meaning, and also that the word level information is very important for prediction of most of these language regions. So now on to another type of work that tries to understand or disentangle the contributions of different timescales in prediction of the brain activity. So the idea here is that natural language contains information in multiple timescales, so ranging from phonemes to narratives. And the human brain is processing this in some hierarchical representations of different timescales. And so one idea is to try to isolate this from a regular natural language processing model. But these authors, led by Shirley Jane and her co-authors, what they did was they actually created a new natural language processing model that had specific units that were for specific timescales in the model. So this is so the work that I'm citing here has used this model, but it also cites the original model by some selection of these authors that created this model. So now they're actually they show that each individual unit in this hidden representation of the model is encoding a different time scale. And what they can do is they can look at which of these, what are the voxels in an fMRI recording sensitive to in terms of these time scales in the neurons in the individual intermediate representations. So they showed that utilizing these NLP models that explicitly represent the different timescales allows this voxel-wise estimation of preferred timescales. So what they showed here, I didn't mention this yet, but so the auditory cortex was mainly shown to be preferred for shorter timescales, and the prefrontal cortex and the precuneus, for example, so the medial side of the brain, was shown to be to prefer longer timescales here. So this is similar to previous results that showed this, but this is a much cleaner type of analysis that is really disentangling these different timescales in a computational modeling way. And then other types of work try to disentangle syntax from semantics in the representations in the brain by trying to also disentangle them in the original NLP representations and then see what is being predicted, which regions in the brain are being predicted by these disentangled representations. And so these authors created different syntactic representations first, and then they did a subtraction analysis where they had a full feature set that included semantic and syntactic features. And they looked at how much does that full semantic and syntactic feature space predict the brain activity, and then they subtract the amount of prediction that is just due to either semantics or syntax. And so what they find is actually that, so the syntactic structure-based features that they constructed explain some additional variance in the language regions over some complexity metrics that, some syntactic complexity metrics that were previously used to show that there's, let's say, effort in processing some kind of sentence. But they also, what's very interesting here is that they showed that the regions that are predicted by syntactic or semantic features are very difficult to disentangle. So it seems like the whole language network is doing some kind of mix of syntax and semantics. This is according to these authors. And then this is actually validated by another work that came out sort of concurrently, or was done concurrently. So this was already discussed by Manish a little bit, but here the authors tried to disentangle these lexical and compositional representations in the models, as well as the syntactic and semantic representations. And I'll go over this kind of quickly, but here the underlying, the takeaway here is that the syntax and semantics also don't seem to be associated with separate modules in the brain, at least, again, according to this work and the previous work. So this kind of replicates the finding of this previous work. And I have just two more works in this section. So, so we've discussed a lot about these representations from neural networks, but one thing that we've overlooked is that the representation is actually consists of several different functions that are combined together. And so, for example, for BERT, that BERT has multiple attention heads, that each attention head is its own function that acts on the previous representations, and that has been learned over a large corpus of data. And so some people in the NLP community who are trying to analyze BERT and other transformer models in terms of what linguistic information are they learning, have shown that some heads seem to be more important than other heads when talking about syntactic processing or other types of tasks. And so these authors here tried to actually look at this. So they isolated, this is also very recent work, so they isolated different heads, different attention heads in these models, and they correlated the performance based on these heads on syntactic tasks with how well does the prediction from these heads of the brain activity do. And so they show that in several of the language regions, but not all, you get this high correlation between the performance on specific syntactic tasks and brain activity prediction. And so this basically says that perhaps if we decompose these NLP representations a bit more than these previous works, we can actually reveal some correlations between these syntactic computations and prediction of fMRI recordings. And so far we've been talking about predicting just one region based on some NLP representations, but we are interested in this information processing pipeline in the brain. So how, for example, how do regions work together to help us process stimuli? And so I want to tell you about one issue with using encoding models to answer this kind of question. For example, here, this is a thought experiment. So let's take this stimulus, which has both vision and auditory information. And let's say the vision information is very important for this voxel in the visual cortex, and the auditory information is very important for the voxel in the auditory cortex, of course. And so what we're interested to know is whether the stimulus is influencing these two voxels in a similar way or in a different way. And so we can build this kind of Mickey Mouse schematic where these two gray circles you can think of as the variance in each different area. And this variance in the stimulus is overlapping with both of these different areas, but in different ways. So that the stimulus is actually important for both of these areas, but in different ways, right? So one area is influenced by the visual information, the other one by the auditory information. But so now, if we use a very rich, very complex AI model, which takes as input both the language and the visual information, and we build a stimulus representation of this movie, which contains both the language and the visual information, then we get the stimulus representation which overlaps with the brain areas also in some non-overlapping ways. And so when we actually use an encoding model to evaluate this, we might get very similar performance using this stimulus representation in both the visual and the auditory area. But that doesn't mean that both the visual and the auditory area are influenced the same way by the stimulus. And so encoding models are prone to this. And so we proposed a framework that can help us investigate this further and understand whether two regions are influenced by a complex stimulus in a similar or different way using still computational methods. And so it's a bit hard to see here, but this graph is basically what we saw before. So we have two different areas, and we have a stimulus and a stimulus representation. And our framework allows us to be able to disentangle all of these areas. So area 1, 2, 3, and 4, which actually give us an answer to whether the two areas are influenced the same or a different way by a specific complex stimulus. And I'm not going to go through this because it's quite complex, but in the paper we have a kind of a decision tree framework which tells you how to interpret different results that you get from the metrics that we propose that help us do this scientific inference. And so just one result from this paper. So here we use the same data set that actually we use in the hands-on today. So this is Hidden Figures data set, so it's a movie. And we used representations from a language model, so it didn't include vision in the representations. So using an encoding model, we see that we can predict all of the language areas significantly. So again, it's difficult to disentangle these language areas in terms of what information is processed in these areas if you just look at an encoding model. But if we apply our metric, our framework, we're able to get different types of inferences from this framework. So for one example here I'm going to give is this A inference from the posterior temporal lobe to the angular gyrus. So what this inference says is that even though these two regions are predicted very highly by the stimulus representation that we had, they are in fact respond differently to this complex stimulus. So we see that there are some different effects. Okay. So in contrast to these encoding models, our proposed framework can actually be used to make these types of inferences about are these regions predicted similarly or differently by the complex stimulus. Okay. Great, and that was it. We went through that faster, luckily. And now we can go over to, actually, let's pause for questions first. Okay. Actually, we're right on time. It's 4:12. Okay, so if there's no questions, I will hand it over